Welcome to the Sit 'em Stardom podcast for week 11. I'm your host, Josh Shepardson, and you can follow me on Twitter where I post as @bchad50. And jumping right into things, where I'm going to advocate sitting a quarterback who's been very good this year, but he's coming off of a down game and he hasn't been playing exceptionally great of late. And that's Andy Dalton, who travels on the road to play Arizona. He's averaging 269.2 passing yards per game this year, 18 passing touchdowns, but he's facing a solid pass defense of the Cardinals. And the matchup just doesn't look right, and he hasn't been playing well of late. He hasn't bested 250 yards passing in his last 4 games, and he's been very touchdown dependent. That's not the type of volatility I like to embrace when there are some other quarterbacks with some good matchups this week, fringe starters, and even some guys that aren't normally considered starters who have some good matchups. A couple of guys, for instance, who I would start over Andy Dalton this week include Matthew Stafford against the Oakland Raiders, Marcus Mariota in the Thursday night game against the Jacksonville Jaguars, and the highlighted player below, who I will leave unnamed momentarily, but we will get to him. Moving on to running back, I would sit James Starks this week. He was a starter last week. He is technically a starter this week, but Eddie Lacy's back. Eddie Lacy's been announced to get the second set of reps, or the second series with the first team offense. Starks will open the game with the offense, but really sounds like an RBBC where the hot hand's going to get the bulk of the carries. That should be James Starks. Eddie Lacy's been lost all year, but in the event that Lacy does look good, there is some serious risk that Starks ends up losing some touches to Lacy. Probably going to be fairly even split, and the Vikings have been pretty good against the run despite an opponent's defense. Their Football Outsiders rank is 28th defending the run, but they haven't given up a lot of yardage. They just haven't played a lot of good run offenses, and to be honest, this Packers run offense isn't very good either. So this is a situation where Starks is going to have a hard time getting a great deal of volume of work, and it makes a lot more sense for the Packers to attack the Vikings through the air. So go ahead and avoid James Starks this week. He should be rostered still. Don't go and do anything crazy like cut him. He looked okay in his start last week, but didn't take advantage of a really great situation against the Lions. Next up is another guy who I advocated starting last week, but and he delivered fairly modest line, 7 receptions for just over 70 yards. But this week he's got a much tougher assignment, and that's Kamar Aiken of the Baltimore Ravens facing the St. Louis Rams. He's a number 1 receiver for his team, but not a true number 1 receiver at all. A guy who is realistically on a good team, more of a wide receiver 3. But pushed into wide receiver 1 duties. Might get targeted a bit this week. He was targeted 14 times last week, but the problem is he's going to have a tough assignment. Janoris Jenkins is a very good cornerback, and the Rams are a very good pass defense. They're not allowing many touchdowns to receivers, just 3 so far this year, and not allowing many fantasy points to wideouts. So really tough assignment for Aiken. I actually think that some of the other pass catchers on that team, maybe the tight ends, Max Williams, Crockett Gilmore, perhaps a fullback, and some secondary, former Ram Chris Givens, might see some more action than Aiken and cut into that volume of work. But even if he gets a fairly solid volume, was not efficient last week, only caught half of his targets, and I don't think that's going to cut it this week against a tough Ram secondary. Moving on to tight end, Martellus Bennett is laying an egg basically all year. He has looked like the second best tight end on his own team the last couple of weeks, with Zach Miller playing very well. And he just has not been a very productive pass catcher this year. The offense hasn't included him as much as it did last year or even the year before. And the matchup is not a good one with the Denver Broncos. Broncos have been stingy in the passing game to basically all pass catchers. Earlier in the season, they had a softish rank at Football Outsiders defending tight ends, but they're not giving up a lot of fantasy points to tight ends, and Bennett just has not been a huge part of that offense. There are some tight ends with some better matchups that are widely available, and obviously you're not starting Bennett over the studs at the position. So I'm going to pass on Martellus Bennett, keep him glued to your benches this week. Moving on to the positive side of the podcast and the article that I'm covering here is the stardom side of things. And Derek Carr has been on fire lately. He has one clunker on the season, and that is the season opener against the Bengals. But beyond that, he's got 3 straight games of eclipsing 300 yards passing, and he's done so in 5 of 9 games this season. He's tossed multiple touchdowns in 4 straight games and 7 of 8 games since the season opener, where he struggled mightily with the Bengals. He's playing really well, and he has a soft matchup against the Lions. Good team total this week, and his pass catchers, his receivers are playing at a really high level. Amari Cooper and Michael Crabtree. So really like Derek Carr this week. Probably should be starting him every week going forward as well as he's playing. Moving on to running back, we got Jonathan Stewart against Washington Redskins, and he has carried the ball 20 plus times frequently this year, or 20 or more times, I should say, very frequently this year. He scored at least 1 rushing touchdown in 3 of his last 5 games. So even though Cam Newton and Mike Tolbert are there as vultures, he's getting work. He's making the most of that work. And with the Panthers checking into 7.5-point favorites at home this week, I do expect him to continue to get a heavy workload, and 20-plus rushes could mean 100-plus yards from Stewart this week, in which case he wouldn't even need a touchdown to provide value. But there is still that touchdown upside. I think Stewart's going to get another heavy workload, and averaging 77.3 yards from scrimmage so far this year, averaging 18.8 attempts on the rush attempts, excuse me, and facing a defense that's allowing 135.3 rushing yards per game. So a lot of arrows pointing upward for Jonathan Stewart this week, and a really good matchup that I like for him. Moving on to receiver, we got Stevie Johnson ascending the pecking order for targets in San Diego with injuries to Keenan Allen and Malcolm Floyd, as well as Antonio Gates playing at less than 100%. Chiefs have been tough on tight ends this year too, so a little bit of added incentive for Phillip Rivers to air it out to his new wide receiver number 1 in Stevie Johnson. Johnson's played well in the past with much lesser quarterbacks than Phillip Rivers. Now he's playing with an elite level quarterback against a defense that's allowing a ton of fantasy points to wide receivers. And this is a really good matchup and an opportunity for him to get some serious targets and get some serious work. So, I mean, they've coughed up the Chiefs have coughed up the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. So it really doesn't get much juicier than that. Get Stevie Johnson in your lineups. Finally, moving on to tight end, Jason Witten has struggled at times this year, and I mean that's really mostly a product of playing with some less than stellar quarterbacks. Matt Castle, Brandon Whedon, not NFL caliber starters. Tony Romo's back this week. Witten has had his best games of the year with Romo under center. Romo started the first 2 games of the year. In those 2 games, Witten totaled 17 targets, which resulted in 15 receptions for 116 yards and a pair of touchdowns in the season opener. All ships on that offense. The Cowboys rise with the return of Tony Romo, and that includes Jason Witten. Go ahead and get him in your lineups against the Miami Dolphins. Probably more of a back-end tight end one, but a solid play with Tony Romo playing quarterback again. That's going to wrap things up for the Sit 'em Start 'em podcast for Week 11. Check out all the content on fantasyfootballcafe.com and get all the info you need to win your matchups this week and your matchups going forward. Good luck.